Hello, it is so good to be with you. Um, I wish I could be with you in person, but I love being with you this way. And I always feel that it's a kind of homecoming. This is my parents' region, and I'm getting emotional thinking about it. It's either that or it's possibly the subject matter today. I'm not going to say too much else of familiarizing. I would love to, but I already have too much stuff, so I'm going to jump right in. Our theme today is Remember Me.
Mm.
I love a good stroll down memory lane, finding a letter, a picture that calls to mind a relationship or an experience that I'd forgotten. I love that. Our theme today, though, is less a stroll down memory lane and more of a plea, remember me, a plea from women who may have dropped from our collective memory. There is so much that we can learn from them. You know, there's truth in the old saying that if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. The pleas from our sisters past to remember me are also nudges for us to notice what may be going on around us now, to notice women we may otherwise forget, even in our own time, women who our faith would call us to see. Today, we're going to remember three biblical women, Hagar and Sarah, and the unnamed daughter of the warrior, Jephthah. Their harrowing stories are remembered in awful detail in a book by Phyllis Tribble called Tales of Terror. Tribble rightfully calls these tales of terror, and they will be triggering for many of us. So we walk this path with care. But these stories are in our Bible for a reason, and these women call out to us to remember them. The stories of Hagar and Jephthah's daughter would not normally be connected. One comes from the origins of the people of Israel, the other from the period of the judges many generations later, post-patriarchs, post-slavery in Egypt, but pre-monarchy. These stories come together. They approach each other when we ask the question, what about the women? Then we see that both stories, set far apart in time and circumstance, come from a larger common frame. Both stories are shaped by a social system that scholars call patriarchy, in which economic, social, and cultural power are handed from father to son in a male-dominated household. And women's main role is to produce a son. Patriarchy is the setting for both of our stories today. Let's first remember Hagar. We're going to read from Genesis 16, 1 through 10, and 13 through 16. I'm going to go ahead and read that. I may skip a verse here or there in the interest of time, but I'm going to read basically all of that section. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave whose name was Hagar, and Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. He went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave is in your power. Do with her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, You are Elroy, for she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son who Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Now, let me pause here for just a moment to say that between chapters 16 and 21, a lot happens. You may want to go read it at some point. Sarah does indeed become pregnant at 90 years of age. One might ask if this is a blessing or a curse, even in patriarchy. She gives birth to a son whom they name Isaac. Sarai and Abraham during this time are given new names, Sarah and Abraham. So back to Hagar's story. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, do not let me look upon the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Here ends the reading. Well, the setup for our story comes in the first line of our reading. Now that Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. In the verses just before, which we did not read, God has promised Abram that though Abram does not yet have an heir, nevertheless, he will have descendants as numerous as the stars. And old as he is, in his 80s now, Abram believes God, and God reckons it to Abram as righteousness, as the Bible says in Genesis 15:6. Sarah, on the other hand, covenant or no covenant, knows for certain that in the normal way of things, she'll not be presenting Abram with children, not at this point in their lives. So she takes matters into her own hands. And now we see that Sarai has been infected with patriarchy's hierarchical norms. She is the one who orchestrates the trauma that Hagar will experience. In her privilege as the spouse of the head of household, in her sense of need to fulfill woman's duty in patriarchy, that is to provide a son, Sarai makes a plan. We might also say in her lack of faith that God will be faithful to God's promise. God has said there will be descendants. She doesn't need to take matters into her own hands. But Sarai, both privileged and also the victim of patriarchy and lacking in faith, uses the enslaved Hagar as an object for her own purposes. She proposes to Abram that he go into my slave, that I shall obtain children by her. And that is what happened. Abram did as he was told, and Hagar conceived. Which in this patriarchal society immediately lifts the status of this enslaved foreign woman in everyone's eyes, including in her own. Hagar now looks with contempt upon her barren mistress, and Sarai in return abuses Hagar to the point that Hagar runs away, only to be sent back by God, but with a promise that she also will have numerous offspring, so much so that they cannot be counted. So back in Abraham's household, Hagar bears a son to Abraham who names him Ishmael. Unfortunately, Hagar's woes have just begun. Sarai has the son of her own, as old as she is, and her desire to see her son receive the full inheritance causes her to cast out Hagar and Ishmael to live or die in the wilderness. Now, there's so much more to this story to pull out. I'm just barely touching a few pieces of it. Hagar is no shrinking violet. Hagar's voice before God, for example, as well as before Sarah, are worthy of remembering. And yet, Hagar is so often one of the forgotten women of the Bible. She who is not only victim of her patriarchal time and society, but of another woman as well. We need to remember her because in our own time, we have seen this pattern repeated. Was 1920, for example, the year that women got the right to vote? Well, not really. 1920 was when white women received the vote. Women of color could vote finally as of 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. In fact, many of the leading suffragettes were deeply racist. Forgetting Hagar allows the same thing to happen again and again. Conversation among white women and sisters of color will reveal the many ways in which white privilege and economic privilege still today allow slights and injustice to continue, even among women, when we would surely do better to band together as one. In contrast to Hagar's story and Sarah's, let's remember Jephthah's daughter. We read Jephthah's story in Judges, Judges chapter 11, beginning with verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return victorious from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and there was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrels and dancing. She was his only child. He had no son or daughter except her. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You have become the cause of great trouble to me, for I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. She said to him, my father, if you have opened your mouth to the Lord, do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has given you vengeance against your enemies, the Ammonites. And she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Grant me 2 months so that I may go and wander on the mountains and bewail my virginity, my companions and I. Go, he said, and he sent her away for 2 months. So she departed, she and her companions, and bewailed her virginity on the mountains. At the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did according to the vow he had made. She had never slept with a man. So there arose an Israelite custom that for 4 days every year, the daughters of Israel would go out to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite. Here ends the reading. Now, there are some things to know about Jephthah. He was the son of a prostitute and a man named Gilead. But he is not known as the son of Gilead. He is known as Jephthah from the town of Gilead, Jephthah the Gileadite. His father does not claim him. Now, Jephthah grew to be a great strapping man, but illegitimate. And his half-brothers did not want him to share in the inheritance, so they drove him away. In those days, the Ammonites made war against Israel, and Israel needed a fierce warrior to lead them. So they appealed to Jephthah to be their commander, and Jephthah said he would if, on his successful return to their country, they would make him head. They agreed, and in a series of battles, Jephthah defeated many clans of the Ammonites. The Lord gave them into the hands of Israel, says Judges 11:21. With yet more fighting on the horizon, our story begins. Our story begins this way. It says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. Note, God is with Jephthah now. He has already blessed him with many great victories, and yet, perhaps out of insecurity from his fatherless life experience in this patriarchal culture, Jephthah feels that he needs more assurance. He can't just have faith in God's presence. He needs to do a deal. And so with God already on his side, Jephthah promises if only God will give the remaining Ammonites into his hand, Jephthah will give to God as a burnt sacrifice whatever comes through the front door to greet him when he returns victorious. We have already read the horrifically tragic rest of the story. God did give the battle into the hand of the faithless Jephthah, who shouldn't have needed more assurance from God, who shouldn't have needed a big splashy entrance, and still faithless Jephthah has made this foolish vow. And when he comes home, who comes to greet him? His one and only daughter comes out with timbrels and dancing to welcome her daddy home. He tears his clothes and says to her, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. What? Who has brought him low? But she, as much a part of the system as he, responds, my father, if you have opened your mouth to the Lord, do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth. As with Hagar, Sarah, and Abraham, the daughter and her father are both caught in the web of patriarchy and see no way out. The daughter will be sacrificed because of the faithless vow of the foolish father, as Tribble puts it. The daughter acquiesces, but she negotiates a brief reprieve. Grant me 2 months so that I may go and wander on the mountains and bewail my virginity, my companions and I. Now Jephthah's daughter will surround herself with her girlfriends, her community of support. Together they will roam the hills and mourn the loss of her opportunity to be a wife, to become a mother, with both the personal joy and the social status that would have brought to her. Unlike Hagar, women are her source of support in her last days. And we are told that the women of Israel remembered her. A custom rose up for the daughters of Israel to spend 4 days every year together to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. As Tribble says, no longer isolated, at the time of deepest sorrow, she reaches out to other women, shifting the focus of the story from oblivion to remembrance. Today we remember Hagar, used and abandoned by both the man and the woman with agency in her life, but who is ultimately a survivor and the mother of a nation. And we remember the unnamed daughter, the sacrifice of a foolish, faithless vow by a man himself the victim of patriarchy. She claims a place in memory through the cohort of women who surround her at her moment of greatest despair. Some of you may know that my favorite Bible scholar is Rick Lowry. He has spent his whole life studying scripture in depth. One conclusion he has reached is that sometimes the purpose of the Bible's stories is to show us bad theology and bad action. Some stories tell us, don't do this. Some stories tell us, God is not like this. In remembering Hagar's story and asking what of the woman Hagar, we see that God had already promised Abraham progeny as numerous as the stars. It was Sarai's lack of faith in God's promise that led to abuse and abandonment for Hagar. God, in the end, saved Hagar and blessed her as the mother of a nation. And faithless Jephthah's vow, is that what God wanted? No. We can see now no need to have made that vow, no need to follow it through once made. Even in the worst stories, there are things to learn. Sometimes it is, remember so you don't do this. These stories remind us to ask in our own time, what about the women? What about the economically marginalized? What about the abused and abandoned and sacrificed? Women bought and sold at Super Bowl games. Women terrorized in their own homes. Girls still told in so many ways they might not be good at math or science. What about all of us women positioned still at various rungs of social hierarchies like Hagar and Sarai were? What about the ways that economics, race, nationality, sexual orientation, age, so many other factors affect the life stories of women and men in our communities and world, and cause some of us to align ourselves with the forces that keep others down? We can remember and do better. The biggest question remembering poses is this: what kind of God do we worship and represent? Is it a God who remains silent while a foolish father makes a vow that takes the life of his child? A God who approves competition for the spoils of inheritance in a world of scarcity, enslaving some at the hands of others? Of course not. We worship a God of abundance who created and creates enough for all, meaning that competition, enslavement are not necessary ever, but rather a faithless response to a misreading of God. When we ask, what about the women? We put the mirror on terrible theologies of our own time that would slot people into hierarchies of human value, instead of a theology that understands that all people, women and men, are made equally in the image of one God who is love. Let me close with a memory of mine. Many years ago now, it may have been my very first ever quadrennial, back when disciples women met every 4 years in quadrennial. It was back at Purdue, and then we were in a big auditorium for a big keynote, some 4,000 or 5,000 women. And we were hearing stories of forgotten women. And our keynoter asked us at one point, if you know of a woman in your life or experience who has suffered abuse of any kind, don't say a word, just stand. I was there with my mom and my sister and with women from my congregation. And there was just this moment of silence and stillness. And then there was this whisper of the rustle of skirts and bodies moving to their feet. I stood I looked around me. My mom was standing. My sisters was standing. The sister was standing. The women from my congregation were on their feet. Nearly that entire crowd silently on their feet, attesting to the knowledge and memory of a woman of their experience who had suffered abuse. I'll never forget that moment, that whisper of skirts and other jeans, I suppose, too, as we rose to our feet. It was a reminder of all the women we knew and all the people they represent, children of God, beloved of God, whose voices whisper then and now, remember me. In those whispers and in the nearly forgotten voices of women in scripture, may we hear the voice of the God we worship, the God of love and abundance, calling us to remember and to act. May it be so.